Imagine discovering that you were never meant to truly live. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, but literally. You were manufactured. You have an expiration date. And every moment of your life is on borrowed time. That's the moment one of gaming's most beloved characters realizes the truth of their existence. Not a hardened soldier, not a brooding anti-hero, but a small, timid black mage named Vivi. And somehow, a game that looks like a colorful fairy tale becomes one of the most profound stories ever told in the history of the PlayStation. Final Fantasy IX is often said to be the most misunderstood Final Fantasy in the entire series. When Final Fantasy IX released in July of 2000 for the original PlayStation, it arrived at a strange moment in gaming history. Just 3 years earlier, Final Fantasy VII had redefined what the RPG genre was supposed to be. Then Final Fantasy VIII arrived, pushing even further into cinematic realism and the science fiction aesthetic. So when the next game appeared, players saw things such as cartoonish characters, medieval castles, crystal mythology, and oversized fantasy armor. To many people at the time, it looked like the series had gone backwards instead of forwards, but that assumption missed the entire point of this game. Final Fantasy IX was never about trying to move the series forward. It was about remembering. It was about reflecting on the series' past. Final Fantasy IX was never meant to be the future of the series. It was something much stranger, something much rarer. It was a farewell, not just to the PlayStation, not just to the 1990s, but to an entire philosophy of game design. Because by the year 2000, the video game industry was beginning to change rapidly. Budgets were exploding. Technology was pushing developers towards realism, spectacle, and cinematic presentation. Games were becoming larger, louder, and more ambitious. And in the middle of that transition, the creators of Final Fantasy made a strange decision. Instead of chasing the future, they stopped. They looked backwards in time, and they asked themselves a different question. What made Final Fantasy magical in the first place? The answer wasn't cutting-edge graphics. It wasn't realism. It was imagination. Crystals, airships, black mages, strange worlds filled with eccentric characters and esoteric symbols. So Final Fantasy IX became a deliberate return to those roots, a storybook world, a theatrical tone, a celebration of everything the series had accomplished up to this point. In other words, while the rest of the industry was sprinting towards the future, Final Fantasy IX paused to remember the past, to pay homage to those who had come before. And that kind of creative decision is rarely seen in today's modern gaming industry. To understand Final Fantasy IX, you have to understand the man behind it, Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of the Final Fantasy series. By the late 1990s, Sakaguchi had already changed gaming history, but his role inside Square had shifted dramatically. Younger creators were experimenting with modern storytelling and technology. Meanwhile, Sakaguchi had a different idea. He wanted the final PlayStation Final Fantasy to feel like a celebration of everything the series had been up to this moment. So he built Final Fantasy IX around one simple concept, a return to the roots. Classic fantasy worlds, airships and kingdoms, black mages, crystals, adventurous heroes. But this wasn't nostalgia for just nostalgia's sake. It was a reflection on everything that had come before. He wanted the game to carry a deeper set of themes and a deeper philosophical tone than earlier entries had in the series. And that leads us to the real heart of the game. At its core, Final Fantasy IX is about a single terrifying question. What gives life meaning if life is to end? Almost every character in the game is wrestling with their mortality. Let's start with Vivi. Vivi is a manufactured soldier, a black mage created to fight in wars. But he doesn't know this at first. Then he meets other black mages who reveal the truth to him. They don't live long. Their lives simply stop. Imagine being a child and discovering your species has a built-in death timer. That realization sparks one of the most powerful arcs in the entire game. Instead of despair, Vivi asks himself a deeper question. If life is temporary, if my life is to end, what should I do with the time I am given? This theme echoes throughout the entirety of the story. The villain Kuja is also terrified of his own mortality. But where Vivi finds meaning and purpose, Kuja chooses the path of destruction. Two characters facing the same existential truth and arriving at completely opposite ends of the spectrum. That philosophical tension drives the entire narrative forward. The game repeatedly explores the themes of life, death, and memory. And this is where Final Fantasy IX becomes one of the most mature stories written for the entire Final Fantasy series. Not because it's dark, but because it asks the oldest philosophical question humanity has: how should we live our lives knowing one day we will die? And here we have the irony of the game. The most existential Final Fantasy ever made looks and feels like a storybook. Oversized heads, bright colors, charming medieval towns, and that contrast is deliberate, because the game understands something powerful about storytelling. Sometimes the deepest truths are easier to confront inside a fairy tale. Fairy tales have always worked this way. When a story removes itself from the real world, it also removes many of the defenses we normally use to avoid uncomfortable truths. In a realistic setting, discussions about death, identity, loneliness, or purpose can feel heavy, even confrontational. But place those same questions inside a fairy tale, and something changes. Suddenly, these ideas become much easier to approach and absorb. The monster represents fear. The journeys represent personal growth. The kingdom represents entire philosophies about how people should live and conduct their lives. And the characters can embody parts of the human experience in ways that realistic fiction often can't. Fairy tales give us emotional distance, and that distance creates clarity. When we watch heroes battle dragons or travel between kingdoms, we're really watching symbolic versions of struggles we all experience in our daily life. Finding purpose, forming relationships, facing loss, and accepting change. The fantasy removes the noise of the real world and leaves only the emotional truths behind. That's why some of the most profound ideas in human culture have been passed down through myths, legends, and fairy tales. And it's why Final Fantasy IX still feels so timeless to this day. While other entries in the series continued to push toward realism, such as Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX intentionally returned to the language of classic fantasy. Not because it was simple, but rather because it allowed the game to talk about life's deepest truths in the clearest, most easy-to-understand way possible. In the end, fairy tales aren't escapism, they're mirrors. They strip away the complexity of everyday life and reveal the fundamental questions underneath. Who are we? Why are we here? And what do we do with the limited amount of time that we are given? Final Fantasy IX may look like a whimsical fantasy on the surface, but that fairy tale setting is exactly what allows it to ask some of the most honest and brutal questions about life. While the character Vivi represents the question of existence itself, two other characters in the game represent something just as important: how we choose to live once we accept that existence. One of the most interesting contrasts in Final Fantasy IX is the relationship between Zidane and Steiner. On the surface, they couldn't be more different. Zidane is carefree, a thief, someone who moves through the world guided by instinct and empathy rather than rules. He helps people not because it's his duty, but because it feels right. Steiner, on the other hand, is the embodiment of structure, a knight of Alexandria whose entire identity revolves around loyalty, duty, and obedience. His worldview is built on hierarchy, discipline, and unquestioning service to the crown. Early in the story, Steiner sees Zidane as irresponsible and untrustworthy. Zidane sees Steiner as rigid and hopelessly naive. But this contrast is more than just comic relief. It's intentional. Steiner represents a life defined by external meaning. His purpose is given to him by institutions, the throne, the kingdom of Alexandria, and the traditions of knighthood. His identity exists because a system tells him who he is and what he must do. Zidane, on the other hand, represents the polar opposite. Zidane is a free spirit. For him, meaning doesn't come from duty or obligation, but rather the relationships around him. When someone is in trouble, he doesn't pause to ask whether it is his responsibility. He simply acts. For Zidane, doing the right thing doesn't require a title, a rank, or an order from anyone. It's about choosing whether or not he considers it to be in line with his personal code of ethics. One acts from the heart, the other from honor. One believes in freedom, while the other in structure. And yet, in the end, their paths often lead to the same result: protecting the people they care about. This contrast is what makes Final Fantasy IX so compelling. It reminds us that there's more than one way to be a hero. Whether you follow your heart like Zidane or adhere to a code of honor like Steiner, it's your choices that ultimately end up defining you and the life that you live. Final Fantasy IX often serves as a philosophical reminder that two separate paths can often lead to the same result. In the end, Final Fantasy IX isn't just another entry in a long-running series. It's a world that feels alive, intimate, and profoundly human. It's a game where every character carries a philosophy and a choice. Zidane teaches us that courage can come from empathy, that doing the right thing doesn't require a rank or a command. It just requires a willingness to act. Steiner reminds us that honor, duty, and loyalty aren't just outdated ideals, but things that give life structure, meaning, and a sense of purpose. And Vivi teaches us that even in the face of uncertainty and the fear of our own impermanence, existence itself is meaningful, and every moment deserves our full attention. What makes Final Fantasy IX extraordinary is how it balances these ideals, showing that freedom and duty, heart and honor, courage and existential reflection can all coexist into a meaningful existence. It's whimsical, yes, with its fantastical kingdoms and talking Moogles, but beneath the humor and charm is a deep meditation on what it means to be truly human, the bonds we form, the choices we make, and the courage to follow them. That's why there will never be another game like it. Later titles in the series pushed boundaries with technology, battle systems, and graphics. But Final Fantasy IX captures something that can't be upgraded or remade. It captures something that is truly timeless. A perfect harmony of storytelling, philosophy, and heart. It's a reminder that a game can be fun and adventurous while still exploring profound truths about life, morality, and connections. It's not just a story about saving the world. It's a story about how we choose to live in it. And that's why Final Fantasy IX will forever remain unique. A game that doesn't just entertain, but touches the very soul of what it means to be human. If you liked this deep dive into the philosophy behind Final Fantasy IX, then please consider giving this video a like, as it greatly helps the channel's reach. And please subscribe for more videos on the philosophy of gaming. Comment down below what you'd like to see in future videos. That's my rant, and thanks for watching.